We spend our whole lives rooting for the purple, our purple pride, our purple people eaters, but have we ever stopped to ask why they're purple in the first place? It's more controversial than you might think. Welcome to the Locked On Vikings podcast.
You are Locked On Vikings, your daily Minnesota Vikings podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Locked On Vikings podcast, where we're always trying to learn something new. It's part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you so much to my hashtag everydayers for making Locked On Vikings your first listen of the day every single day. Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off of your first purchase. Today on the show, we're doing something a little bit different. If you're seeing this, it's because I am out of town and unable to record a podcast the day before like I usually do. So if there's any major breaking news item you expected me to cover on this podcast today and you're not going to get it, that's why. I'll get to it when I get back in town. But for this time, I figure we could revisit a little bit of Minnesota Vikings history. It's been a few years since we talked about this on this show. The last time we spoke about Minnesota Vikings history was in 2022 when I was in the midst of making my Minnesota Vikings history documentary series. You can still find it on patreon.com/LukeBraunNFL. It's a 7-part series. Each episode's, it's 7 hours total. So it's average about an hour. Some are longer, some are shorter. Think of it like a season of TV about the Minnesota Vikings with all kinds of stories you might not be familiar with, explanations of things that you might not even know, like how did the Herschel Walker trade go so bad and why the Minnesota Vikings are purple. And I wanted to go back and tell a couple of stories about it during this kind of dead period of the offseason, both because I like the stories a lot, but also there's a couple things that I've learned about since that didn't make it into the show that I want to revisit there. So when you're done with this, I really would love it if you went and checked out my Patreon page. It is free to watch. You don't need anything. You don't even need to sign up. You can just follow the link to my Patreon page, go to the collections tab, and find the history of the Minnesota Vikings. You can watch the entire thing right there with no strings attached. But what I wanted to do was kind of take this by the decade. So this is going to be a series of episodes like this for times when I'm unable to record, where we'll talk about the Vikings through the decades. This one will actually encompass a lot more than a decade because the origins of the Minnesota Vikings stretch well beyond 1961 when they were first actually incorporated into the NFL as a team. And in fact, to understand this story, you have to go back to 1926, the fledgling NFL. This is still the days when teams were very often named after the business that sponsored them. So the Duluth Kellys, or I guess Kelly Duluths if you want, because it was a Kelly Duluth hardware store, was their main sponsor. So they were the Kellys, and they were one of these sort of fledgling NFL teams. You have a few that you would recognize, the Green Bay Packers, the New York Giants, but you also have the Pottsville Maroons and the Dayton Triangles, which I believe would go on to become the Chicago Bears. You had the Chicago Cardinals, who would later move to Phoenix and Arizona. All of these crazy teams, right? And then you had, of course, the Duluth Kellys. But in 1926, a couple things changed. One, the NFL started to really emphasize the travel portion of it. You have a team from Canton. You have a team from Buffalo. You had teams joining from Los Angeles, and they wanted to kind of make themselves a little bit more of an international thing. I think the greater prevalence of long-term travel, it was a little easier to get on a train. There were these things called planes that were kind of coming up. That might be an interesting thing to explore one day. I think that maybe got was inspirational to this, but either way, right? Traveling teams were a big deal. They wanted to make it feel more like a national football league rather than a series of kind of local scrimmages. And the other thing that happened is the Kellys lost their sponsorship. The owner of the Duluth Kellys is a guy named Ole Hogsrud, who is a name that you might be familiar with if you're really familiar with Vikings history. He will come back up again. And he named them after a term I know we're not big fans of anymore, but in the interest of this is history. It's a different time. So I hopefully you can have a little grace about it. They were the Duluth Eskimos. And then they signed a guy named Ernie Nevers. Ernie Nevers was the king of kings. He was one of these athletes that was so nationally recognized that having him on your football team was immediately the ticket. It would be like bringing, LeBron James into your NBA team. But in a time when there wasn't really already like a national sort of, there wasn't TV, right? So this is way earlier than all of that. Ernie Nevers, and they would actually name the team instead of the Duluth Eskimos. They were the Ernie Nevers Eskimos. And they did a barnstorm of more than 20 games over that season. They were everything the NFL wanted. They were traveling. They were a big ticket. And, they would basically be able to fill out the stadium all over these towns. This was a big deal because there was some competition called the AFL that was joining up in the same way. It's not the AFL Lamar Hunt thing you knew about later, but it was similarly a competitive league built by people who kind of wanted to do things their own way. You can go look at the prologue for more about that story of the prologue for the history doc that I did. Anyways, the Ernie Nevers Eskimos went all around the league. They were a massive success, and they were actually a decent team despite having to play this ridiculously brutal schedule of, play a game, get on a bus, maybe 2 days later you're playing another game. And this is a much more brutal version of football than we see today. They didn't have pads. They had leather heads. Maybe that was it. And they would hit hard. You didn't have these safety rules or really any concerns. This was a time when it wasn't that weird for a player to die on the field. It was something that wasn't common by any stretch of the imagination, but it wouldn't be unprecedented. That barnstorm arguably saved the league, which is an argument I make in the prologue of the history doc. But what it does is it creates a lot of goodwill for Ole Hogsrud in particular. The next year, they tried to do the same traveling team setup. They only played one home game in 1926. In 1927, they tried to do the same thing, but it was disastrous. Everyone was, I think, a little beaten and broken still. They were still kind of nursing all of, bodies just hadn't recovered over the offseason from the ridiculous slog that they had been put through the year before. But it also just, I don't know, year to year, right? Things happen. It still happens today that way. Sometimes you're just not as good next year. So Ole Hogsrud sold the team back to the NFL and the rights to all of the merch and the IP and all of that back to the NFL. But in that deal, he made sure that there was a clause that he would get 10% or the rights to buy 10% of any new football team that they would start in Minnesota. Ole Hogsrud was a Duluth High School graduate, and Duluth High has purple as their color. Ole Hogsrud was in the room when they were deciding, hey, we're going to put a football team in Minnesota. What should the colors be? As a 10% owner, he got in. So you could argue that the Vikings are only purple because a hardware store decided to stop promoting an NFL team in Duluth in 1926. But here's the thing. If you ask the wrong person and tell them that story, they will tell you that they've got a whole different deal and they'll get real mad at you about it. So we're going to keep talking next on Locked On Vikings. Today's episode of Locked On Vikings is brought to you by Game Time. It's the best place to find tickets to any sporting game or any event, whatever you're trying to get to. But if you're the kind of person that decides, hey, let's run to a baseball game this Saturday and look up tickets last minute, Game Time is perfect for you because ticket prices sometimes go down as the event draws closer, as people are trying to get rid of their tickets last minute, and Game Time can navigate that, find the deals, and pass the savings on to you. Or if you're trying to get your Vikings plans lined up for the year, maybe you are trying to go internationally, Dublin and London, check Game Time for those ticket prices right now, because they're like lower bowl tickets for less than $500 a pop, which is pretty crazy for such a big event as the international game. So go check out those deals. You can take the worry out of buying. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off of your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download the Game Time app today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. Many of you know the story of the AFL, not the original one that went for 1 year in 1926 and was defunct because Ernie Nevers was such a cool ticket that he kind of overshadowed that new league, but rather the AFL that became the AFC and merged with the NFL and created the Super Bowl era. As it goes, Lamar Hunt and a number of other mostly oil tycoon type guys wanted to make teams. There was Bud Adams, who would eventually create the Oilers. Lamar Hunt. There was, the original owners of the Bills, the Jets, all the old AFL teams. They wanted NFL teams, but the NFL was a bit of an exclusive boys club, and they would always shut them out. And they were not nice about it. This became pretty petty. This was a pretty spiteful thing. And a lot of the origins of NFL teams come from this particular beef between a whole bunch of like eccentric rich guys from the 1960s. Lamar Hunt, the most eccentric and maybe the richest. I don't want to say that for sure. But he really thought that, he was a Texan oil guy. And he thought that there should be football in Texas. There was no NFL team in Texas. And he thought that was ridiculous. So I'm going to make the Dallas Texans. And, and I'm going to build my own league about it. We're going to get all these other people in. That guy wants a team in Houston. We're going to have another team there. Somebody wants a team in San Diego. We're going to do that. There's a team in Denver. We're super ready to do all this. There was also a group of rich guys. And also Sid Hartman had like a really key role in this. Again, watch the history doc. But Max Winter was the key guy there. He of Winter Park fame, right? Max Winter was the dude. He was the dude. The sort of principal funder of all of this big purchase that was about to be made. So they contacted him and they said, hey, you want to join our new football league? Heck yeah, let's do it. So the Vikings were set to be an AFL team and would have eventually been an AFC team. George Halas, head honcho of the NFL at the time, in many, many ways, was sort of the ringleader of all those of that ownership group, that original ownership group. And he was starting to feel a little threatened by the AFL. Originally, George Halas was the one telling guys like Lamar Hunt, hey, no, you can't be... we're not going to give you a team in Dallas. No, we're not going to let you buy the Detroit Lions. No, we're not going to. We've got these teams. We've got this setup. We like it. Sorry, but thanks, but no thanks. Nobody is for sale. But when the AFL started to be clear that the AFL was really going to be a competitor to the NFL, like a real cropped up alternative to the NFL and its sort of stuffy brand of football, George Halas didn't like that. And he decided, you know what? Maybe we are going to be open to expansion all of a sudden. And you know where we're going to put a team? Dallas freaking Texas. And we're going to call them the Cowboys. Take that, Dallas Texans. Your new fledgling team is not going to get more hype than a brand new actual NFL team that's going to get, the Green Bay Packers and the Chicago Bears coming to town all the time. So he hoped that would sort of cut the head off the snake. Take out the business prospects of Lamar Hunt's team. He's the main ringleader of this. If he no longer feels it's good business, the whole thing will collapse. But to do that, if you're going to add one team, you kind of probably want to add two so that it's still an even number. And also, we maybe want to still continue to sabotage the AFL. So George Halas and a group of NFL kind of business types called around to all of the people who were going to own an AFL team, including Max Winter, and said, hey, we're open to expansion. You want to do this whole setup? You're making a team? Why don't you come join us? By this point, though, it was pretty contentious, and it was, you kind of would be siding with the enemy to do that. So they all said no, including Max Winter for a while. But at a certain point, he changed his mind, and right before the inaugural AFL draft that was supposed to be in a hotel room in Minneapolis, they were going to host it, Max Winter took Halas's deal and said, okay, we'll be an NFL team. We'll bail. This left the AFL scrambling. It left Lamar Hunt very angry, and anger he held until the day he died, by the way. It totally threw everything off, which in exactly the way that George Halas wanted. Eventually, they managed to get a buyer who would fill in that spot of the 8th AFL team. They found him in Oakland. You can play in the A's stadium. We're going to be good to go. And they had their draft And that is how the Oakland Raiders were born. The only reason the Dallas Cowboys exist is because Lamar Hunt had his Dallas Texans and they wanted to shut him out, which, by the way, it worked. The Dallas Cowboys absolutely obliterated the Dallas Texans in terms of ticket sales and business. The Dallas Texans could not survive in Dallas. They moved to Kansas City and became the Chiefs. And the Vikings and Chiefs would meet in the fourth ever Super Bowl, the second one that the AFL would ever win, and the last one before the actual official merger. That Super Bowl was the culmination of all of these different revenge narratives, not even mention Bobby Bell, who got drafted by the Vikings and Chiefs jointly in 1963, because that's how it worked. They didn't coordinate, so both teams just drafted players, and every college prospect had to just kind of like pick a side. And Bobby Bell picked the Chiefs because the Vikings lowballed him, and now here he is playing him in the Super Bowl. And that game, there's lots of talk about how that game went, right? But that game was filled with all of this subtext of the origins of the AFL, the betrayal that was Max Winter betraying them, the AFL, and now the actual flagship team of the AFL, Lamar Hunt's Chiefs, get to go show up the Minnesota Vikings, who were one of the better teams in NFL history to that point, that everybody just assumed. I mean, they were favored by 14 points going into that game. And when they lost, it was this big statement that like the AFL is here. The merger had already been agreed to by that time, but it was very legitimizing for it. And of course it had all of these ripple effects to the Vikings and beyond. This was the sort of that year was sort of the coming out party for Bud Grant's Vikings, and the Bud Grant era is a totally different thing that we'll get to in a later episode of this series. But part of the reason that the Vikings had been successful in 1969, but weren't when they first started as an expansion team in the first couple of years, was because they had finally gotten themselves a real general manager in Jim Finks. The guy before that, his name was Bert Rose, had a huge impact on the Vikings, as well as their first head coach, Norm Van Brocklin, the Dutchman, who everybody in the media hates a lot. And the story is not complete without him. That'll be next on Locked On Vikings. For those of you who listen who are not Minnesotans, you may be familiar with Amy Klobuchar, current senator. You might not be familiar with her father, Jim Klobuchar, who wrote this awesome book, Purple Hearts and Golden Memories. This is a book I couldn't get my hands on until after I had finished the documentary, so there are some anecdotes in this that I wish I had included, but it just didn't work out that way. One of those anecdotes is actually the introduction to the book. Jim Klobuchar was a Star Tribune sports reporter for years and years and years and years, an absolute legend of the game, a deeply well-respected man in the media, and it was early in the 60s. The fledgling Vikings, who kind of couldn't win a game, they were so new, learning how to walk, and expansion teams back then, you didn't really expect anything from them for the first 4 or 5 years. And so we were kind of in that point where you were just kind of happy if they managed to like show up and everybody was there and all the equipment made it. And Jim Klobuchar, crack journalist that he was, had a relationship with Norm Van Brocklin, the Dutchman, Stormin, Norman, whatever you wanted to call him. And the reputation that he holds as this cranky guy, this paranoid, like really weird dude, fascinating story in his own right. But he also had a relationship with Bert Rose, who was nominally the GM of the Vikings. Really, Norm Van Brocklin was making more of the football decisions about who to take in the expansion draft or in college drafts, who to sign in free agency and stuff. Bert Rose was more of a CEO of the organization. He was more like a team president, is probably closer to the role that you would like give him today. But he did have control over roster stuff, and he also had control over a lot of the origins of the franchise. If you ask Bert Rose's family why the Vikings are purple, he would say, as a PR guy, Bert Rose was a publicist for the Rams and got hired to the new expansion Vikings after the deal with the NFL had been struck. He would say, well, there wasn't a purple team yet, and we thought it would be a good idea to stand out. He thought it was a business decision. Ole Hogsrud would say, I just like purple as my high school team. Their descendants will still disagree about this. If you ask one of them, hey, did Ole Hogsrud, if you ask a member of the Rose family if Ole Hogsrud made the Vikings purple, they'd be like, absolutely not. It was my grandpa. The feud continues to this day over this, which I find absolutely stunning and fantastic. The original cartoons for like the logo, the original drawings of what the uniforms and the helmet, the horn on the helmet they still have and all of that was drawn by a cartoonist named Carl Hubenthal, excuse me, who all of his cartoons are still in a museum in US Bank Stadium. You can actually see an exhibit in the stadium of all of the original like doodles and stuff, which is, I think, really, really cool. And the brand of the Vikings as the sort of winter warriors, unfortunately, wouldn't really show up until Bud Grant got there, because for Bud Grant's ice, Norm Van Brocklin was fire. So as this Jim Klobuchar story goes, he had a relationship with Burt Rose. Of course he did, and he was asking him questions and stuff. One night before a game against the Lions, a game in Detroit, so they're all in a hotel, he was talking to Burt Rose. They were talking about like the steak joint down the road. And Norm Van Brocklin saw this, paranoid and fiery man that he was. He confronts Jim Klobuchar about this. It's about midnight. And he says, "What are you talking to Burt Rose for? If you want information, you get it from me. The media should only ever talk to me. You shouldn't talk to anybody else in the organization. I'm the only person you should get information from," because he wanted to control what the media thought and said. Jim Klobuchar was like, "Okay, well, I'm a professional journalist, so yes, I have relationships with everybody. What are you talking about?" And by the way, we were talking about steaks. Van Brocklin was like, "BS you were. Let's fight about it. Should we do this in my hotel room or in the lobby?" And Jim Klobuchar was like, "I'm not fighting you, man. What are you doing?" Norm Van Brocklin says, classic journalist. I think he was a little more crass about it, but classic sissy journalist maybe is the best paraphrasing I can get away with on a podcast without an explicit rating. This was enough for Jim Klobuchar to be like, "All right, let's go to your hotel room. Let's hash this out." And yes, indeed, Jim Klobuchar and Norm Van Brocklin duked it out in Van Brocklin's hotel room somewhere around 1 a.m. in Detroit before a game. They wrestled each other into the TV and smashed it and landed on the bed, and it was a pretty short scuffle, but that was kind of it. And a couple hours later, this is like 3 a.m. now, Van Brocklin calls Klobuchar again and says, "Let's talk about this like men. Let's go to my place. We'll order eggs and beer." It's just a wild sequence of events that kind of feels like it could only happen in the 60s. But that was the kind of thing, the relationship that Van Brocklin had with everybody, but the media in particular had that relationship with him. At this point, I should probably bring up the other documentary series that John Boyce made. If you want to hear us talk about it with each other, we did that episode when his Minnesota Vikings history doc, which was also, I believe, a 7-part series, came out. His came out a year after mine, and it turned out that we were actually simultaneously making it at the same time. It's a really cute story. I emailed it to him because he was a big inspiration for me making mine. And I said, "Hey, I made this. You were a big influence on me. Your work was, and so here's the thing. I would love it if you watched it." And he didn't respond for like a year, and I didn't think really anything of that until he did email me back. He's like, "Sorry, this took so long." Like I was like getting impatient. "Sorry, this took so long. We're making our own, and I didn't want to watch yours because I didn't want to like couch any ideas." And I was like, "Oh my God, you're making a Minnesota Viking. That's so cool." So I loved his. I want you to watch both, and then watch the interview that I did with John Boyce on this podcast about it. But his is informed, as all of his content is, a lot more by journalists, media, newspaper archives, stuff like that. Mine was informed, I think, a little bit more by player books, autobiographies and stuff, the writings of Bud Grant or Denny Green or Robert Smith or Scott Studwell. And so it was a little bit of a different perspective when you read, say, Carl Kosolki's words or Fran Tarkenton's words or Jim Marshall's words about Storm and Norman. It's a more complicated relationship. And his relationship to Fran Tarkenton was the reason that Tarkenton ended up doing a stint with the Giants in between being part of the fledgling expansion idiot Vikings and the actual Super Bowl juggernaut Vikings that would go to 4 Super Bowls, 3 of them quarterbacked by Fran Tarkenton. But it's complicated. Depending on the mood you get, you got Fran Tarkenton, and he'd have a different answer for you. Sometimes he would say, "Oh, we fought a lot, but it was, that we had this understanding, and it was this like kind of thing, this like manly love, tough love thing." Sometimes he would say, "Yeah, I hate that guy." I think the answer was a little different before he died and after he died. Norm Van Brocklin died in the 80s of a heart attack. The whole story as it goes revolves around Tarkenton's scrambling and how Norm Van Brocklin, who was, I like to consider, he was like the Peyton Manning of the 50s. He was one of the best quarterbacks. He was the best quarterback of all time undisputed when he retired. Everybody thought he was the GOAT. And so it would be like if Peyton Manning retired, coached the Ravens, and then told Lamar Jackson not to scramble. Like, that would be the kind of idea that we had. But the role that scrambling itself played in their relationship, again, it shifts depending on when you ask Fran Tarkenton about it or when you would ask Norm Van Brocklin about it. Sometimes they say, no, it wasn't really about scrambling. Like, yeah, we kind of argued about that in our meetings like you would argue about anything. But really, Tarkenton just didn't like the way that Norm Van Brocklin talked to his players, or Van Brocklin thought Tarkenton was soft or whatever. Either way, it came to a head, and eventually Tarkenton demanded a trade to the Giants in a story that's been well documented and is, of course, told in the documentary series as well. But I think maybe no better story describes Norm Van Brocklin than when he once was so mad at a referee, he just started throwing pocket change at him. He just grabbed the nearest projectile that he could get his hands on, which was the change in his pocket, and started just launching pennies at a ref. The football pre-Super Bowl era, pre-merger in the 1960s and beyond, was such a different game that was fascinating. And actually, there is a book that I would love to plug, not an ad, but just something I recommend, that a listener that's written by a listener to this show who emailed me once and said, I wrote this book. You should check it out. It's called Mill City Scrum. I love this book. It is, a lot of times it feels like you're reading Pro Football Reference from 1919, which it doesn't exist. Like, a lot of what's on Pro Football Reference, according to this book, is wrong. And part of the reason that this guy wrote that book as a historian was because he knew that it was wrong. And he wanted there to be a central authority because he had access to that information. He had access to more of the historical record about what scores were, who won what game, what everybody's record was, and how things went. What teams were there. And it's so cool to watch football evolve, pro football evolve, from essentially kind of people trying to relive their college football days, because college football grew up earlier than pro football grew up, but everybody would graduate college and still want to play with each other. So they decided to make it an exhibition and say, well, what if we put on a big thing and see if we can sell tickets and make a business out of this? And to watch it grow from that to a sort of military exercise almost, to, the game we know today, something more recognizable as the game we know today, is really fascinating. But even looking back to the 60s and Norm Van Brocklin, I mean, could you imagine if a coach threw a quarter at a ref today? It'd be the story of stories. It would be the guy's legacy entirely. For Van Brocklin, it was just another crazy thing he did, alongside inviting reporters up to his hotel room to fist fight him, and, yelling at people and calling all of his players stiffs, which is the way he described his expansion team, which he maybe wasn't wrong about, but that's probably not a great foot to get off, especially, when one of those stiffs that was joining the team, it was via trade, not the expansion draft, but one of those guys was Jim Marshall. So it wasn't all stiffs, buddy. You got Grady Alderman there, and he was, the stalwart left tackle for the Vikings for a decade. But either way, the 60s of the Vikings was a very chaotic time that ended in this sort of coming out party in 1969. But that coming out party can't be the main narrative nationally, because the main narrative nationally was about how Lamar Hunt finally got one over on the NFL. There's so much more I could sit and talk to you about. I could do this for an hour, and I did it for 7 hours. Go check it out. And I will see you all for the next one. And of course, if there's any major news, again, if there's anything, big signing or big trade or something that I missed, I'll get to it when I get back in town. Until then, I will see you all later. And as always, Skol.